I'm Timothy Sisk, Professor of International Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. I'm here this morning to talk to you on a beautiful sunny day here in Colorado on the upcoming Paris 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Happy to be here because I just published a brand new book on the topic on sport and international politics with the subtitle Beyond Power and Peacebuilding. And that's where we see sport. It lies between the global international system of powerful states trying to do what they can in a messy international order, and the world of sport, which is to be the world's greatest cultural and sporting event, the Olympic Games coming to Paris together with the Paralympic Games. And sport and politics have always been intertwined, and so this book takes a look at these relationships and asks the question, how does sport contribute to peace, if at all? And so what I'd like to do is offer you 10 insights from a professor of international studies on the upcoming Paralympic and Olympic Games in Paris. What does international studies and international relations offer to the world of international sport? Baked into the cake of the Olympic movement is its promise that it contributes to peace internationally. But at the same time, if we look back at the history of the Olympic Games over 120 years since the revival of the modern Olympics in 1896, we see no consistent pattern whatsoever with the holding of the Olympic Games and the diminution or the reduction of war in the international system, or even the kind of momentary ceasefires that could occur, for example, during the Olympics, as they allegedly occurred during the ancient Olympic Games. So this raises a big question. If the Olympic Games promises to contribute to peace, yet there's no empirical relationship between holding the Olympics and the reduction of violence in the international system, we have to ask ourselves, does the Olympics more reflect international society and the international order, or does it really shape it as it intends to? This is the key question. We look at the history of the Olympics from 1896 through 1900, and when the Olympics were held in Paris, again in 1924, and now for the third time in 2024. We have to ask ourselves, is it more about the projection of national power, projection of national identity, maybe what social psychologists would call performative national identity? Is it more about the projection of power, or does it really contribute to peace, as the Olympics would like to claim? Well, Paris 2024 promises to offer some really surreal moments in international politics and in our very turbulent world. The most recent data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program shows 59 active armed conflicts around the world, and yet the Olympics is to celebrate the springtime of humanity. And while the world is on fire with wars in Sudan and Ukraine and Yemen and Gaza, at the same time we're supposed to be celebrating the commonality of humanity through sport and through sport achievement. And so this is a real surreal moment and an important moment for the Olympics to be able to demonstrate that it can be a beacon of hope in a truly turbulent world, one in which there's atrocities, human rights violations, and gross inequalities around the world. So this disconnect between the Olympic fanfare and the realities of our turbulent world promises to be one of the most poignant aspects of the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. Well, all Olympiads, like the Paris 2024 Games, are wrapped up in the internal politics of the country as well as the international politics of the era or the moment. So today within France, we saw President Emmanuel Macron calling a snap election before the Olympics after European elections revealed the strength of far-right parties in France. And at the same time, those elections led to election of far-left candidates as well, such that President Macron comes out of this in a somewhat weakened but still standing position in the run-up to the Paris Olympic Games. And the Paralympic Games that follow. So one of the key aspects of the internal politics is that the Olympics are designed or are brought to town to bestow legitimacy on the government. The government of France faces any number of domestic issues. Among these challenges we see are very deep divisions, a polarized political environment, threats of domestic terrorism have already been seen. Cyber attacks coming from within France and abroad, a lot of concerns about the sustainability aspects of these games. And like all Olympic Games, the French authorities, particularly the Parisian authorities, have tried to kind of clean up neighborhoods and the result have kind of cleared out areas where have led to some forced relocations of people and concerns about the daily lives of Parisians when the Olympic comes to town. What we've seen in Paris, like in all Olympiads, is that sports provides not just a global stage for the athletes, but also those who are seeking to advocate for different causes in the international system. I think the most important one that I've seen are protests in the run-up to Paris where disability advocates climbed onto the Paris metro and showed how inaccessible the Paris metro is for those with disabilities. This then led to President Macron announcing a €1 billion package of immediate efforts to make Paris more accessible for those with disabilities in the Olympic Games. So we see that the Olympics provide a stage, they provide an opportunity for people to advocate for different causes, be it the cause of those suffering in war, protests in Paris, supporting the Ukrainian athletes who are coming to Paris, and those 280 plus Ukrainians that have lost their lives in the battlefields of Ukraine that could have been Olympians or were Olympians in Tokyo 2020. And so again, the Olympics provides an opportunity, a stage for those to advocate for human rights, for LGBT rights, for transgender rights, for the rights of those displaced by war. So we see that, well, the sport contributes to human rights. It does, because it provides an opportunity for individuals, for civil society organizations to make claims for human rights, for disability rights, for sexuality rights, and for the rights of minorities and others who have been oppressed in various societies around the world. We'll see protests at the Games. When I see protests at the Olympic Games, I often think of it less in terms of protest and contention and more in terms of claiming human rights. One of the biggest controversies of Paris 2024 is the news report issued by the New York Times and Deutsche Welle in April of this year, in which 23 Chinese athletes were alleged to have been having returned a positive test for TMZ, which is a heart medication, the same medication that caused so much controversy at the Beijing 2022 Olympic Games, and particularly for Russian ice skater Kamila Valiev. And so the positive test of 22 Chinese athletes with a contaminated blood sample have underscored the concern that, like in Russia, perhaps in China, there's a process or program of state-sponsored doping. This has become one of the most contentious issues between the United States and the U.S. Anti-doping authorities here in the United States, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, and the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency. So every time that we see a Chinese swimmer winning a medal in the swimming pool in Paris, we'll have to ask ourselves, is that one of the 23 athletes that were alleged to be doping? Have the Chinese engaged in state-sponsored doping? And we'll look for those controversies in the swimming pool and in the aquatics arena in Paris. We can anticipate no more than about a dozen Russian and Belarusian athletes at the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. They'll be competing as what's called independent neutral athletes, and they won't be bearing the uniforms or flags or participating in any kind of team representing Russia or Belarus. These countries were suspended from the Olympic Games because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which happened in February 2022, right between the Olympic Games and the start of the Paralympic Games. So what this did was break what's called the Olympic truce, which is a UN General Assembly resolution passed before every Olympic Games since 1994 that calls for all countries around the world, all armed groups, to stop fighting during the period of the Olympic Games. This goes back to some myths about the ancient Olympic Games and the truce of the gods, even back into Greek mythology, that the gods themselves would cease their incessant fighting during the period of the Olympics. But since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the special military operation, and its ally Belarus in 2022, that completed what had been already in process, which I call the divorce between the Russian Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee. We have to keep in mind Russia hosted the Olympics in 2014 in Sochi, and out of that came the revelation of a massive state-sponsored doping program in Sochi and massive corruption in the holding of those Olympic Games. So it was the state-sponsored doping, which had been upheld for through a judicial process through the Court for Arbitration of Sport, plus the invasion of Ukraine during the period of the Olympic truce in 2022 that has completed the divorce between Russia and the International Olympic Committee. Now, there's still a number of Russian nationals who are very senior officials within the International Olympic Committee, but we won't see Russia marching in the opening ceremonies. We won't see Russian athletes wearing any kind of uniform like they did in Tokyo 2020 that sort of reflected their nationality. The 12 or so Russian and Belarusian athletes that we'll see in Paris tend to already be internationally recognized athletes on the global stage. They're only allowed to participate if they do three things. They have to renounce the war in Ukraine. They have to not be a member of any Russian military organization, and they have to pledge their support for the International Olympic philosophy of promoting peace among nations. So we'll see very few Russians. I'll be looking primarily for Daniil Medvedev, the international tennis player, and a couple of other Russian athletes, some of which don't even live in Russia anymore. So there's no longer universality in the Olympic Games. Big powerhouses like Russia, which of course assumed this role of the Soviet Union, which was so prominent in the Olympics from 1956 through to 1992. And today, no Russians, no Belarusians. The divorce between Russian Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee, it's complete. In September, the Russians will be hosting what they call the Friendship Games, which is an effort to kind of create an alternative to the Olympics. And so the Olympics are taking great risks in suspending the Russians. The International Olympic Committee would like to move as quickly as possible to get Russians back and to show that the world of global sport is universal. But this seems unlikely to me, at least as long as the tanks are rolling on the fields of Ukraine. Well, Afghanistan will have a gender balanced team. There'll be 6 Afghan athletes, 3 women and 3 men. And as we know, Afghan is one of the most, if not the most, gender repressive societies in the world since the return of the Taliban in 2022. And what we've seen is that the International Olympic Committee said to the Afghan Olympic Committee, look, unless you have women participating, we won't be extending an invitation for you to come to Paris. So the Afghans have relented. There'll be 3 Afghan women, 3 Afghan men. And this reveals overall the efforts of the International Olympic Committee to put together a gender-balanced Olympics. For the first time, there'll be the same number of female athletes and male athletes among the 10,700 Olympians in the Olympic Games, which run from July through late August. However, let's keep in mind that the world of sport is still not gender balanced, still not gender neutral. There is a long way to go in terms of women's empowerment in sport. Access to sport for women around the world is one of the most critical issues. The World Health Organization, for example, reports that 3 out of 4 adolescent young girls around the world do not have access to safe sport. Well, the one moment I'm looking for in Paris, and a little contra to my own nationality in this case, is that come July 24th, when the United States plays South Sudan, even though I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm rooting for South Sudan. South Sudan's one of the newest countries in the world, only became independent in 2011. It's been racked by war, by ethnic strife. There's upcoming elections in December, which promise to be highly volatile, a potential for return to civil war. So the appearance in Paris of 13 South Sudanese athletes is an amazing thing, 12 of which will be the South Sudanese basketball team, which qualified for the Olympics by beating Angola in the FIBA basketball tournament in November 2023. And these 12 South Sudanese young men, many of who play in the NBA, come from different ethnic groups in Sudan. They're supported by the NBA and supported by the organization Basketball Without Borders. These 12 young men will be representing national unity for South Sudan in a way that no politician, no actor or film star ever could. This is a moment of unity for South Sudan. We hope them all the best. Their very appearance at the Olympic Games will be a real moment of nation building for this young war-racked country in Africa. I'll be rooting for South Sudan, even though they're up against the U.S. Dream Team 3.0 and will face a real uphill challenge on that in the basketball tournament. By the way, they'll also be playing Serbia, and as we're here in Denver, our very own Denver Nugget, Nikola Jokic, will be playing there in Serbia. So we'll see some of these dynamics with the South Sudanese basketball team. They're heroes in their countries, they're heroes for peace, and we'll be rooting for them in Paris to be sure. The Olympics is all about myth-making. Many people call the Olympic Games a secular religion. That is, if you think about it, you come to the Olympics and you say you're an alien that drops in from outer space and you see this celebration going on, all of these costumes, the music, the marching, the procession, all of those outfits, right? You might think, what is this, some kind of big religious ceremony? In many ways, we could look at the Olympics as an attempt to create kind of a secular religion based on the philosophy of humanism, based on the notion that humanity can continually improve and continually better itself. So we see this even in the Olympic motto, always trying to go higher, faster, stronger. Together is the new Olympic motto. But the Olympics are very much about symbols, myth-making, iconographic moments, evoking that sort of ancient Greek mythology. But the truth is, as a social scientist, we know that these kind of rituals, symbols, processions, things like the opening ceremonies, the rings, the anthem, the release of doves, this is all classic myth-making. As observers, what we want to be is just a little bit wary to know that this is an effort to try to share a worldview, share a kind of ideology, the ideology of Olympism, the idea that through sport, humanity is better. And so I'm wary of the myth-making, I'm wary of the symbols. They're too easily manipulated by those who would use them for their own purposes. Probably the best example of that is the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, where the Nazi regime used the Olympic symbols, used things like the torch relay to imbue legitimacy on the fascist regime of National Socialism. And I think in Paris, what we're going to see is a lot of that sort of symbolism and mythology. I would just say let's all be kind of a little bit critical and wary, knowing that this is pure invention of tradition. There's nothing inherently sacred about the Olympic Games. It's another sporting event, a bit like the Super Bowl. Well, there's all kinds of opportunities for reform of the International Olympic Games and of the Paralympic Games. One of the things that's always struck me as a longtime professor of international relations is that the Olympic Games comes before the Paralympic Games. And this has happened since 1994 when the Paralympic Games began to be held alongside or in tandem with the Olympic Games. So Paris as a city, in its bid for the 2024 Olympics, had to promise to both host the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. But here's how it works. All of the world is focused on the Olympic Games by able athletes, bodily able athletes. And then 2 weeks later, all of the Olympic signage, everything's all taken down, and boom, we pop up to see the International Paralympic Games with its own logo, its own set of myth-making and symbols, most of which are extremely important and meaningful, particularly for those with disabilities. The ability to participate in sport becomes critical for those who have experienced trauma, disability through their lives. But I've always thought, as a professor of international relations, that something's wrong here. That in fact, what would be more meaningful in terms of showing how sport contributes to personal resilience, to communities, to national social cohesion, to uplifting the spirits of people around the world, is to highlight first the Paralympic Games, those who've overcome diversity, those who are competing under the most difficult circumstances, and yet producing amazing performances. Why not have the Paralympic Games first to highlight the importance of recovery, of rehabilitation, of inclusiveness for those with disabilities, and then have the Olympic Games, which all end up in the marathon at the very last sporting event in Paris. This becomes a way to really celebrate more fully the role of sport for those who have suffered tremendously or reflect the sort of the spirit of humanity that the Olympics and Paralympics are said to represent. The Olympic Games in Paris 2024 promise to be a really pivotal moment for the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee. This moment of global turbulence with division between the West and Russia and China, the geopolitical tensions, war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, climate change, and human displacement. If the Olympics can show that they represent a moment of solidarity amidst all of this turbulence and uncertainty in our world, Paris 2024 will be a success. At the same time, Paris 2024 could mark the beginning of the end for the Olympic brand. The absence of Russia, the effort by Russia to pull together an alternative to the Olympic Games through its friendship games. This is a key moment. When the Olympics move first to Milan Cortina for the Olympic Games in 2026 for the Winter Olympics, and then to Los Angeles in 2028, we'll see whether the Olympic movement and the Olympic brand, which is now 120 years old, can actually survive this moment of global turbulence when there's so much division in the world, yet the Olympics are supposed to represent unity. It's a very risky proposition for the organizers of the Paris Olympic Games. We hope they go well. We hope they represent a moment of respite in what is a truly turbulent and violent world. And maybe it's an opportunity for the world to take a moment and look collectively at where we're headed and the challenges that we face as a global community. Maybe it could be a moment of solidarity. Let's hope it turns out that way. Paris 2024 promises any number of exciting moments, of opportunities to reflect on humanity's common future. Let's hope that occurs in these Olympic and Paralympic Games.